Welcome. This is Boring History for Sleep. You are listening to a slow, calm narration designed to help you relax, drift off, or simply unwind after a long day. Tonight, we begin a quiet journey into the world of medieval knights. Not the knights from fairy tales or fantasy novels, but the real knights of history. The armored horsemen who rode across muddy fields, upheld codes of loyalty and service, and played a surprisingly complex role in medieval society. So, if you're ready, find a comfortable position, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin our soft-spoken trip through time. The origins of knighthood. Between 500 CE and 1000 CE. Let's travel back to a Europe just beginning to rebuild after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's the early Middle Ages. Roads are broken, central governments are weak, and new kingdoms rise from the ruins of what once was Rome. In this uncertain world, survival depends not on citizenship, but on loyalty. Loyalty to a local lord, or a king, or sometimes, to the man who owns the land you live on. It is from this social arrangement that the knight is born. But not right away. In the 6th and 7th centuries, there were no knights as we understand them now. Instead, powerful landowners maintained small private armies made up of retainers, armed men loyal to a local noble. These warriors were often mounted, since having a horse in those days was a symbol of power, and allowed for faster movement across rough terrain. These were not yet knights in the chivalric sense. They were more like enforcers, muscle for the local lord. Their job? To protect, to collect, and sometimes, to intimidate. But as Europe entered the 8th and 9th centuries, things began to change. New threats emerged: Viking raids from the north, Magyar horsemen from the east, Saracen incursions from the south. And in response, kings and nobles needed better organized military systems. The rise of feudalism. Between 800 CE and 1000 CE. To deal with constant threats and the lack of central military power, Europe gradually developed a system we now call feudalism. At its core, feudalism was about land and loyalty. A king or a powerful noble would grant land, called a fief, to another man in exchange for military service. This man would then become a vassal, and he would swear an oath of loyalty, a fealty, to the lord or king. These vassals were expected to fight when called upon. And over time, they began to form a recognizable military class, men who trained for war, rode horses, and wielded weapons as their main profession. And so, the knight slowly took shape. Not all mounted warriors were knights, and not all knights were noble by birth. But being a knight began to carry with it a special meaning. A symbol of service, skill, and social standing. Knighthood became both a job and a status. It wasn't long before being called a knight, a chevalier in French, or ritter in German, became something to aspire to. The idea of a warrior bound by honor and loyalty started to spread. The influence of the Church. Between 900 CE and 1100 CE. As the idea of knighthood evolved, it caught the attention of another powerful force, the Catholic Church. Initially, the Church viewed warriors and violence with some suspicion. But over time, they saw an opportunity. Encouraged knights to protect the weak, the Church to defend the faith, the idea and to act with mercy when possible. This was the beginning of what would later be called chivalry, a code of conduct that combined military service with Christian virtue. Knights were expected not only to fight, but to be honorable. To show bravery, humility, and devotion to God. Church ceremonies began to bless the swords of knights. Knights swore oaths not just to their lords, but also to God. This spiritual element gave knighthood a deeper meaning, and helped turn the knight into more than just a mounted soldier. He became a symbol, a Christian warrior, fighting not just for land, but for justice, honor, and faith. Knighthood becomes a formal institution. By the 11th century, knighthood was no longer just a job, it was a recognized rank in medieval society. Young boys from noble families began to be trained specifically to become knights. They would start around the age of 7, as a page. Learning manners, religion, basic swordplay, and horseback riding. At around age 14, they became a squire. An apprentice knight who would serve an older knight directly. He would carry weapons, help with armor, and ride in battles or tournaments. And finally, if he proved himself brave and loyal, he would be knighted, often in a religious ceremony, and rise to full status as a knight. This process was expensive. You needed money for horses, armor, weapons, and servants. So, for the most part, only wealthy families could afford to raise knights. But occasionally, a squire of humble origin who distinguished himself on the battlefield could also be knighted, adding a touch of mobility to an otherwise rigid system. Knighthood was about valor and duty. But it was also about wealth, land, and power. Tournaments and training. By the High Middle Ages, knights were a fixture of European life. But wars were not always constant. So knights also trained, and competed, in tournaments. These were large public events that showcased martial skill. The most famous event: the joust, two knights charging at each other with lances, aiming to knock each other off horseback. Tournaments were not just sport. They were training grounds, social mixers, and sometimes, brutal affairs. In early medieval times, tournaments were dangerous free-for-alls, where injury and even death were not uncommon. Later, they became more regulated, with rules and points. Tournaments allowed knights to win fame, prizes, and sometimes the attention of noble ladies. They also reinforced the idea that a knight was not just a warrior, but also a gentleman. And so, the myth of the knight continued to grow. Knights in literature and legend. The time between 12th and 14th century. During this time, the romantic image of the knight took hold. Poets and writers began to tell stories of noble knights, rescuing damsels, defeating dragons, and embarking on holy quests. The most famous: the Knights of the Round Table, led by King Arthur. Though largely fictional, these tales shaped how people viewed knighthood. Not as brutal enforcers of a feudal system, but as paragons of virtue, courage, and honor. This was the age of courtly love, heroic quests, and the Holy Grail. It was a far cry from the muddy reality of medieval warfare. But the stories were powerful. And they helped cement the knight's place in Western culture as a symbol of both power and principle. Part 2, Page to Knight, The Long Road of Training. In Part 1, we explored how knighthood emerged after the fall of Rome, grew through the feudal system, and was shaped by religion, warfare, and myth. Now in Part 2, we'll slow things down even more, and quietly walk through the long and disciplined journey of becoming a knight. It didn't happen overnight. It took years of service, training, humility, and patience. Let's begin. Stage 1, the page. Age 7 to 14. It all began around age 7. A boy born into a noble or landowning family would be sent away from home, to live in the household of another noble family. There, he became a page. This early stage wasn't about fighting just yet. Instead, it focused on foundational lessons in behavior, service, and early skill building. The page learned table manners, politeness and humility, basic reading and writing, usually in Latin, religious instruction, songs and poetry. But there was also physical training. Pages practiced wrestling, to build strength, riding ponies, to prepare for future cavalry work, running and jumping, for stamina, and often, mock swordplay with wooden swords. They also helped with chores in the noble house, serving meals, cleaning weapons, and observing the life of knights up close. Being a page was about more than just learning, it was about obedience, discipline, and developing the servant warrior mindset that defined the knight's role in society. At the time, 7 years old might seem young. But in the medieval world, children grew up fast. Stage 2, the squire. Age 14 to 21. At around age 14, if the page had served well, he could be promoted to squire. This marked the beginning of formal military training. A squire would be assigned to serve a single knight, often living alongside him and traveling with him on military campaigns or journeys. The life of a squire was hard. But it was also a time of serious learning. Squires trained in sword fighting, with real metal blades, shield defense, horseback combat, or mounted combat, lance work, preparing for jousting and war. They also practiced archery. Though a knight typically didn't fight with a bow, it was useful to understand the enemy's tools. Most importantly, squires learned how to put on and take off armor, both their own and their knights. Medieval armor was heavy, complicated, and often required 2 people to manage. A squire might be responsible for polishing the knight's armor, sharpening swords and lances, feeding the horses, waking early and preparing the knight's gear for battle or tournaments. But not all training was physical. Squires also practiced music, especially the lute or lyre. They learned how to recite poetry, compose letters, and behave with noble decorum. In short, they were preparing to be not just warriors, but gentlemen of their time. Tournaments, the squire's test. Throughout this stage, squires were sometimes allowed to compete in tournaments. These events were like medieval sports matches, a mix of training, bravado, and social gathering. Here, a squire might ride in mock battles known as melees, practice tilting or jousting with lances, perform in front of nobles, sometimes attracting patronage or honor. While dangerous, tournaments were key opportunities for a squire to prove his skill and earn recognition. If he excelled in these events, it increased the chance of being knighted earlier, and with more prestige. But many squires never saw a tournament. Most of their life was quiet, grueling, and focused on service and readiness. The knighting ceremony. Age 18 to 21, or sometimes older. After years of faithful service, a squire who demonstrated loyalty, bravery, and skill might be chosen for knighthood. This moment was both a promotion and a sacred rite. Sometimes it happened in the field. Battlefield knightings were done on the spot to reward bravery. But more often, a formal knighting ceremony was held, often during feasts, holidays, or religious festivals. The ritual usually began the night before, with a spiritual vigil. The squire would bathe, symbolizing purification. Pray all night, often in a church. Confess sins to a priest. And wear a white tunic, symbolizing purity of soul. On the day of knighting, the squire would kneel before a noble or monarch, often with a sword laid upon his shoulders. He would swear an oath of loyalty, pledging to defend the weak, serve his lord faithfully, uphold Christian values, act with honor and bravery in battle. Then, with the accolade, the sword would lightly strike his shoulders, and he would rise as a knight. Sometimes the knight would receive a pair of spurs, a key symbol of knightly rank, a new sword and a horse, gifted by a lord or father. He would now be called Sir, and fully enter the brotherhood of knights. Cost of knighthood. It's important to remember, knighthood was expensive. A knight required a warhorse, which could cost as much as a small house. A full set of armor, meticulously crafted from steel. Multiple weapons, swords, lances, daggers. Servants, including squires and stable boys. Funds for travel, lodging, and tournaments. This meant that most knights came from landed nobility or families with wealth. But not always. Some squires earned knighthood by valor. Saving a lord in battle, defending a castle, or sacrificing for the greater good. These knights of merit were rare, but respected. And though they lacked lands or riches, their knighthood was often more revered, for being earned rather than inherited. Other paths to knighthood. While most knights were created through the traditional route, there were other paths as well. Some were knighted as part of a crusade, religious wars in the Holy Land where knighthood symbolized both military skill and piety. Others were knighted as part of royal ceremonies or coronations, sometimes hundreds of knights at once. And some were foreigners knighted by kings of other lands, as a sign of trust or alliance. There were even honorary knighthoods, granted without military service, though these were more common in later centuries. Still, regardless of the path, knighthood carried weight. It was a badge of social status and a mark of duty. And once knighted, a man was expected to live up to the name. Chivalry, the knight's code. By the 13th century, the idea of chivalry had become deeply entwined with knighthood. Though not a single written document, chivalry was a code of conduct that included loyalty to one's lord and comrades, courtesy to women, protection of the weak and poor, religious faith, and truthfulness. It was part ideal, part propaganda, and part practical. In reality, knights often failed to meet these ideals. But the code of chivalry served as a moral compass, even if loosely followed. It gave shape and dignity to the knight's public role, and provided stories and songs for generations of bards and poets. In this part, we've quietly traced the long, difficult road from page to knight. We've walked through early training, the tasks of squires, the rituals of knighthood, and the ideals of chivalry. Part 3, the daily life of a knight. While stories often show knights in constant battle or heroic quests, the truth was much quieter. Most days were filled not with sword fights, but with training, faith, estate management, and waiting. Let's begin. Mornings, a knight's start to the day. Life in the Middle Ages began with the sun, and so did a knight's day. Knights living in their own manor or estate often had servants or squires who would help them rise and prepare. He might begin with morning prayer, facing east, whispering words of thanks and protection to God. Religious devotion was central. Knights were not monks, but faith was expected to guide their actions. After prayer, there was grooming, washing the face and hands with cool water from a basin, and sometimes a light application of scented oil if it was available. Shaving or trimming hair was a luxury, but many knights preferred to look clean and orderly. Then came breakfast, typically a simple meal. Bread, cheese, ale or watered wine. Sometimes eggs or dried meat. Food was often eaten while standing, or at a small wooden table with a view of the estate. Servants or squires usually ate separately. Morning duties, training, estate work, and reading. Once fed and dressed, the knight's responsibilities began. If no war or journey was happening, a knight had 3 main duties. Training. Managing lands. Maintaining readiness. Let's begin with training. Even outside of battle, a knight needed to remain physically sharp. He might spend an hour or 2 each morning riding his horse around the estate or courtyard, practicing sword swings against a post, training with squires using wooden weapons, running, climbing, or wrestling. This was not casual exercise, it was important martial upkeep. Next came estate management. Most knights were landowners or vassals responsible for managing farms and tenants. That meant overseeing repairs, collecting taxes or dues from peasants, meeting with stewards or messengers, listening to disputes and settling issues on the estate. And for knights who could read, a rare skill, there was often correspondence. He might read letters from his liege lord, write replies with the help of a scribe, or review lists of supplies. A literate knight was highly respected. Training the next generation. Many knights were also responsible for the training of squires and pages. In the courtyard or outer fields, the knight might show proper sword technique, demonstrate riding positions, correct mistakes, give speeches on loyalty, humility, and readiness. Training the next generation was a duty of honor. It passed down knowledge and preserved the ideals of chivalry. Pages learned discipline through observation. Squires learned skill through practice. And knights, by teaching, reinforced their own role in the cycle. Midday meals and afternoon tasks. As the sun rose higher, the knight would return indoors for dinner, which, in medieval terms, meant the midday meal. This was often the largest meal of the day, served around noon. It could include roasted meats, venison, beef, pork, stewed vegetables, thick slices of coarse bread, pickled items like onions or cucumbers, cheese, ale or wine. Meals were eaten with daggers or hands, forks were rare or non-existent. Servants served dishes, and if guests or fellow nobles were present, the meal could be formal and polite. Music was sometimes played, and religious blessings were offered before and after the meal. Afternoons, business, diplomacy, or leisure. The early afternoon was usually reserved for estate business or travel. Knights might visit neighboring lords for diplomacy, attend local court, settle peasant disputes, inspect crops and livestock, sign contracts or deliver messages. During peaceful times, this could be followed by leisure. A knight might go hunting in the woods, especially boar or deer. Falconry, releasing trained birds to catch prey. Playing chess or early dice games. Listening to minstrels or poetry. Reading religious texts, if literate. Leisure was often tied to status. These weren't idle hobbies, but displays of culture and refinement. And every now and then, afternoons included travel. Knights might be called away to a regional fair, a royal court, a tournament, or summoned by their lord for duty. Evenings, wind down, worship, and reflection. As the day cooled, knights returned indoors. Evenings were quiet. Some knights would sit by the fire, remove pieces of armor or gear, and relax with family or other nobles. They might sip warm wine, eat light bread with honey, or enjoy fruit. If the estate had a chapel or small church, the knight might attend evening prayer, known as vespers. This was a time for silence, reflection, and connection to the spiritual world. Many knights ended the day reading or listening to a priest recite psalms or passages from the Bible. Before bed, they might remove boots, wash their hands and face again, and say a final prayer for protection. Life at a castle versus a manor. Not all knights lived in castles. Most lived on manors, large country houses, often made of wood, surrounded by farmland and peasants. A castle was a defensive structure, usually home to a lord, baron, or count. If a knight lived in a castle, his life was slightly different. More servants. More responsibility for defense. More political visitors. Greater chance of hosting court events or feasts. Castle knights often helped enforce the law, guard the gatehouse, and oversee military drills. Knights in manors were more like military landlords, overseeing crops and peasants, ensuring rent was paid, and maintaining readiness for war. In either case, the knight's life was quiet but disciplined. A knight's bedtime. At the end of the day, knights slept in wooden or stone rooms, with straw-stuffed mattresses, blankets made of wool or fur, often with weapons nearby. Many knights slept lightly, trained to wake at the sound of danger. In the countryside, the night was filled with sounds. Wolves howling in the distance. Owls calling from the trees. Wind against the walls of the manor. Some knights kept a small cross beside their bed, or whispered the Lord's Prayer before closing their eyes. They slept not in luxury, but in watchful peace. Ready for the next day. Faith and ritual in daily life. Throughout every part of the day, faith was woven into a knight's routine. Morning prayers. Meals blessed in the name of Christ. Evening confession or vespers. Knights were expected to attend Mass regularly, often at a local church or chapel. On feast days, they fasted. During Lent, they refrained from meat. On Sundays, they avoided hard labor. Religion shaped how knights thought about duty and death. If killed in battle, they hoped to die in grace, having confessed their sins and fought for a just cause. Many knights even carried small relics or saint charms tied to their belts or swords. Interaction with peasants and the poor. Knights held high status, but they were not kings. They interacted daily with farmers, blacksmiths, servants, cooks, bakers, messengers. A good knight was expected to be firm but fair, to protect his people, to offer shelter during hard winters, to defend against bandits, wolves, or invading raiders. Sometimes, knights offered alms, small coins or bread, to beggars, as part of their religious obligation. But not all knights were kind. Some were cruel, corrupt, or negligent. The ideals of knighthood were high. But reality was often more human, more flawed. Part 4, Knights at War, Armor, Weapons and Strategy. In Part 4, we explore the tools and tactics of medieval warfare. The armor a knight wore, the weapons he wielded, and the battlefield strategies he followed. Knighthood was not just ceremony or code, it was a career forged in steel and sharpened on muddy fields of battle. And so, let's begin our quiet march into the knight's world of war. The evolution of armor. Protection through the centuries. In the early days of knighthood, armor was simple and piecemeal. Around the 9th and 10th centuries, knights wore chainmail, also known as mail, a flexible mesh made of small interlocking rings. A mail hauberk, a shirt of chainmail, might weigh 25 to 30 pounds. It offered solid protection against slashing weapons, though it was vulnerable to powerful thrusts or blunt force. Over time, more pieces were added. Mail coifs for the head. Mail shows for the legs. And padded gambesons underneath, to soften impact. By the 13th and 14th centuries, plate armor began to emerge. First came steel plates on the chest, then arms and legs, eventually becoming the full suits of armor seen in castles and museums today. A full suit of plate armor could weigh up to 60 pounds, heavy but well balanced. Contrary to myth, knights could move, ride, and even climb stairs while wearing them. Each piece had a name. Cuirass, chest plate. Greaves, shin guards. Gauntlets, armored gloves. Pauldrons, shoulder pieces. Helm, the helmet. Crafted by armorers, these suits were tailored to each knight's body. They were expensive, often equivalent to a year's income, and seen as both tools of war and symbols of status. Knightly weapons. From swords to lances. Let's explore the tools a knight used to fight. The sword. The knight's primary weapon was the sword. A symbol of nobility and justice, and also a deadly piece of metal. Medieval swords came in many forms. Arming sword, one-handed, used with a shield. Longsword, two-handed, longer reach, more power. Falchion, a single-edged, cleaver-like sword. Knights learned how to swing, parry, and thrust, both on foot and on horseback. Swords were balanced for both speed and power. A typical sword weighed 2.5 to 4 pounds. They were often named, like Excalibur, and passed down as heirlooms. The lance. For mounted combat, the lance was king. Used in the initial charge, the lance was a long pole, sometimes over 12 feet, tipped with steel. A charging knight with a leveled lance could unseat opponents or pierce armor. Lances were typically used once per charge, then discarded or broken. In tournaments, they were often blunted, though accidents still happened. The mace, axe, and warhammer. To deal with heavily armored foes, knights sometimes used blunt weapons. Mace, a steel head on a short shaft, designed to crush through mail and plate. Warhammer, like a hammer and pick combined, could pierce helmets. Battle axe, a favorite among Norman and Viking warriors. These weapons didn't rely on finesse, they used weight and force to do damage. Knights trained with each, knowing that different enemies called for different tools. Shields. Most knights carried a shield in earlier centuries, though their use declined as plate armor improved. Shields were often heater-shaped or kite-shaped. Made from wood, covered with leather, and edged with metal. They were decorated with a knight's coat of arms, symbols identifying him on the battlefield. Knights used shields to block arrows and sword strikes. Push enemies. Display allegiance in combat. Later, as armor became stronger, many knights stopped using shields altogether, relying on full-body protection instead. Warhorses and cavalry. A knight without his horse was half a knight. Warhorses, known as destriers, were not just large horses. They were trained for battle, to charge, kick, and stand firm amid chaos. These horses were strong, often 15 to 16 hands tall. Expensive, sometimes worth more than a knight's armor. Disciplined, used to the noise of war. Knights rode into battle in formations, waves of mounted warriors called cavalry charges. When timed correctly, a cavalry charge could break enemy lines with sheer force. But if done too early or too late, it could end in disaster. Knights cared deeply for their horses, feeding them oats, brushing their coats, and ensuring their shoes were secure. A bond formed between warrior and steed, one of trust, strength, and shared survival. Archery, crossbows and infantry. Knights were not alone on the battlefield. They often fought alongside foot soldiers, archers, and pikemen. And one of their greatest threats? The longbow. English archers using yew longbows could pierce armor from over 150 yards away. They changed the face of medieval warfare, especially at battles like Agincourt. Crossbows were another danger, easy to load, deadly accurate, and effective even against plate armor at close range. Many knights died not by sword, but by arrow. And so, strategy began to evolve. Siege warfare. Not all battles happened in fields. Many occurred at castles, defended by thick walls, moats, and towers. Sieges were slow, grueling affairs. Knights defending a castle had to patrol the walls, organize food stores, train archers and lookouts, prepare boiling oil, rocks, and hot sand to drop on attackers. Attacking knights brought siege engines, battering rams to break gates, trebuchets to hurl stones, siege towers to scale walls. mining tunnels to collapse defenses. Sieges could last weeks or months. And the longer they lasted, the more desperate they became. Diseases spread. Food ran low. Morale weakened. But knights endured, guarding their lords and lands. Battle formations and strategy. Knights didn't just rush into battle blindly. Commanders arranged knights in tight formations, often with infantry on the front lines, and knights held in reserve. A common tactic. Infantry holds the line. Archers soften enemy ranks. Knights charge the weakened front. This required timing, discipline, and coordination. Knights also used banners and trumpets to signal movement. Different colors or crests showed who was leading each group. If the battle went poorly, a knight might retreat to regroup, or protect his lord as a bodyguard. Every knight knew, in battle, order was life, and panic was death. Wounds, captivity and survival. Despite all their training and armor, knights were not invincible. Swords slipped through joints. Arrows found weak spots. Maces crushed ribs. A wounded knight had to rely on medics or monks with limited tools. Wound cleaning with wine or vinegar. Bandages made from linen. And often, luck. Many wounds became infected. Few knights died instantly, most suffered over days. But not all battles ended in death. Capturing a knight was often more profitable than killing him. A captured knight could be ransomed, his family paying gold or land for his safe return. And because knights respected one another, many captives were treated well, even allowed to keep their armor. This practice created a strange mix of honor and violence, unique to medieval warfare. The end of battle. At the end of a battle, knights returned to camp, bruised, tired, sometimes victorious, sometimes not. They offered prayers of thanks, or prayers for the dead. They inspected armor, sharpened blades, and wrote letters home, if they could write. Some battles were for land. Others for glory. But many knights fought simply because it was their duty. To serve their lord. To honor their oath. To protect what they believed was right. And now, the battlefield grows quiet again. The swords are sheathed. The horses rest. The fire burns low. You've walked alongside knights through armor fittings, justs, siege engines, and cavalry charges. Part 5, The Rise of Knightly Orders and the Crusades. In Part 5, we quietly walk through the religious wars of the Middle Ages. And the knightly orders that rose in their shadows, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights. Together, we'll learn how knights were shaped by faith, glory, and the shifting tides of power. Let's begin. A world divided by faith. In the 11th century, Europe was a continent of kingdoms, duchies, and rising cities. But to most people, the world was divided in simpler terms. Christendom, the lands of Catholic Europe. And the Muslim world, stretching across North Africa, the Middle East, and into Spain. Tensions flared between these cultures, often over religion, land, and trade routes. At the center of it all was Jerusalem, a city sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. When reports came to Europe that Christian pilgrims were being harassed, or that holy places were at risk, Pope Urban II made a call. A call for a holy war, a crusade. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099. The First Crusade wasn't just a war. It was a pilgrimage with swords. Thousands of knights, nobles, and commoners set off toward the Holy Land, promising to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity. They traveled for months across unfamiliar terrain, facing starvation, illness, and battles with local forces. In 1099, after a brutal siege, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, launching one of the bloodiest massacres in medieval history. Though many returned home, others stayed behind, forming Christian states in the Holy Land, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These new outposts needed protection. Knights began to stay, not just to fight, but to serve long-term. From that, the military orders were born. The Knights Templar. Formed around 1119, the Knights Templar were created to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. Founded by Hugues de Payens and a handful of knights, they took monastic vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. They wore white mantles with a red cross. And they lived simply, at least at first. Templars followed a unique path. They were monks, but also soldiers. They trained for war, but prayed daily. They owned no personal possessions, but defended castles. Over time, the Templars grew powerful. They received land, gold, and tax exemptions from kings and the church. They became bankers, managing money for nobles, and even lending to monarchs. Their network stretched from England to the Holy Land. At their height, the Templars were rich, feared, respected, but such power brought enemies. The fall of the Templars. In the early 1300s, King Philip IV of France, deep in debt to the Templars, turned against them. He accused the order of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rituals. Whether true or not, the charges led to the arrest, torture, and execution of many Templars. In 1312, Pope Clement V officially disbanded the order. Some Templars were absorbed into other groups. Others vanished into legend. But their legacy remains, as warriors, bankers, and subjects of endless myths. The Knights Hospitaller. Another major order was the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Order of St. John. They began not as fighters, but as caregivers. Founded in Jerusalem around 1099, they built hospitals for sick and wounded pilgrims. Their name, Hospitaller, comes from the Latin for guest or host. But as violence increased, they took up arms, defending pilgrims and crusader states. They wore black cloaks with a white cross, and became known for excellent medical care, fierce battlefield skill, naval defense of Christian islands. After being driven from the Holy Land, they moved to Rhodes, 1309. Then to Malta, 1530. There, they became the Knights of Malta, and defended the Mediterranean from Ottoman attacks. Unlike the Templars, the Hospitallers survived, and still exist today as a humanitarian organization. The Teutonic Knights. Founded in 1190, during the Third Crusade, the Teutonic Order began as a German hospital group in Acre. But like the Hospitallers, they became militarized. Wearing white robes with a black cross, they followed a strict monastic rule. But they were also fierce warriors, and played a major role outside the Holy Land. In the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights focused on Eastern Europe, especially modern-day Poland, Lithuania, and Estonia. There, they launched crusades against pagan tribes, converting by sword. They built massive castles, ruled over territories, and even founded cities. But over time, their power faded, defeated by local kings and changing politics. Still, they left a lasting legacy in Northern Europe's architecture, culture, and history. Faith and warfare, a knight's dual life. These knightly orders reveal a deep tension. They were warriors, trained to kill. But also monks, called to serve God. How did they balance this? For many, the idea of holy war made violence righteous. They believed killing infidels was not murder, it was divine justice. Dying in battle brought heavenly reward. Obedience to the Pope was obedience to Christ. This gave knights a sense of purpose beyond gold or glory. They weren't just soldiers. They were defenders of the faith. And for centuries, this belief shaped their actions and Europe's history. The later Crusades and decline. After the First Crusade, many others followed. Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149. Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, featuring Richard the Lionheart. Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, which shockingly sacked Christian Constantinople. Over time, the Crusades became more complex, less about religion, and more about politics and control. Eventually, Muslim forces, led by commanders like Saladin, reclaimed much of the Holy Land. By 1291, the last Crusader stronghold in Acre fell. And with that, the era of knights in the East began to fade. The orders returned home. Some dissolved. Others shifted missions, from warfare to charity. Legacy of the orders. Today, we remember the knightly orders through church records, castles and fortresses, art and stained glass, symbols and legends. They influenced banking, military training, charity and hospital care, political systems. And in some form, the Hospitallers still operate, as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, a humanitarian group with ties to the Vatican. Their past is full of contradictions. Warriors and monks. protectors and conquerors, saints and sinners. But through it all, they left a lasting mark on the medieval world. Final reflections. The rise of knightly orders shows how faith and violence, duty and power, often walked side by side. Knighthood was no longer just about castles or tournaments. It was about a global mission, a spiritual war, and the shaping of history across continents. As the fire flickers low, let us remember these stories, quietly, without judgment. Just as whispers from the distant past. Part 6, The Fall of the Knight, Gunpowder, Change and the End of an Era. In Part 5, we followed the rise of knightly orders, and how their sacred missions shaped entire regions. The world was changing. New weapons, new ideas, and new powers were rising. Let's explore how the knight, once the most feared warrior in Christendom, slowly faded into history. The world shifts, from feudal to modern. By the 1300s, the feudal system that gave knights their role was beginning to weaken. Kings were growing stronger. Towns were expanding. And money was replacing land as the true source of power. Rather than relying on loyal knights, kings began hiring professional armies, full-time soldiers paid in coin, not land. Mercenaries from Germany, Italy, and France fought for the highest bidder, without noble titles, oaths, or rituals. The age of honor-bound warfare was beginning to crack. And so, too, was the age of the knight. The arrival of gunpowder. Perhaps the greatest blow to the knight came not from politics, but from science. In the 14th century, gunpowder weapons began appearing on European battlefields. At first, they were clumsy. Hand cannons that barely fired. Bombards that shattered more eardrums than walls. But within a few generations, guns became deadly. A simple arquebus, early firearm, could pierce plate armor from a distance. With little training and no swordplay. No matter how noble, strong, or skilled a knight was, he could fall to a peasant with powder and a match. Knights adapted, adding thicker armor, closed helmets, and visors. But eventually, it became too heavy, too expensive, and too slow to matter. Gunpowder had changed the rules. Castles crumble. Just as knights lost their dominance on the field, the castles they once protected were also fading. Gunpowder didn't just threaten soldiers, it threatened stone walls. Cannons could batter down even the strongest castle towers in days. Fortresses that had stood for centuries fell to gunfire. So architects began building lower, thicker, and angled walls, the beginning of modern fortifications. Knights, trained to defend traditional castles, found themselves out of place in this new age. The castle, once the knight's symbol of power, became a relic. Rise of standing armies. During the medieval period, a king might summon knights by calling his vassals. But now, he could raise taxes, and use that money to hire full-time soldiers. These new forces wore uniforms, trained together year-round, answered directly to the monarch. This gave kings more control, and reduced their reliance on nobles. Knights still existed, but they were now just one piece in a much larger machine. Their personal loyalty, individual honor, and chivalric code felt increasingly old-fashioned. The decline of chivalry. As battles changed, so did ideas. The code of chivalry, loyalty, bravery, courtesy, had always been more ideal than reality. But now, even the pretense of chivalry faded. Gunmen didn't duel. Cannonballs didn't honor valor. And contracts, not oaths, decided who fought for whom. By the 1500s, the knight was still a social title, but not a military necessity. Knights become ceremonial. Even as their battlefield role declined, the word knight still carried respect. Kings began knighting men not for war, but for political service, court loyalty, diplomatic skill. Knighthood became an honor, not a function. Orders like the Order of the Garter or Order of the Bath were prestigious, but mostly ceremonial. Some knights still fought in war, but they did so beside musketeers, pike squares, and artillery, as equals, not superiors. The age of individual battlefield glory had passed. The knight in legend. Though real knights faded, their stories only grew stronger. Bards sang of King Arthur, Sir Lancelot, and the Holy Grail. Even as cannons replaced lances on the battlefield. Writers romanticized knighthood, turning it into a mythical ideal. These tales spread across Europe, inspiring poems, novels, operas, and later, films and games. By the 19th century, knighthood had become symbolic, representing courage, loyalty, protection of the weak. A memory, reshaped through centuries of imagination. Final reflections, the end of an era. The fall of the knight wasn't sudden. It was slow, quiet, and inevitable. Over 400 years, the world changed, and the knight could not remain the same. But they left behind castles, cathedrals, coats of arms, stories of glory and failure. And even now, the word knight still stirs something ancient in the human heart. Perhaps it's the dream of purpose, of honor, of standing firm, even when the world changes. Sleep in the age of steel. You've now journeyed through the entire life of the medieval knight. From childhood as a page, to the shining tournaments of youth, the quiet rhythm of daily life, the chaos of war, the passion of crusade, and finally, the slow farewell to a world of armor and oaths. And here, by the fire, their story ends. Thank you for listening to Boring History for Sleep. If you found peace in this story, if the slow pace helped you unwind, there are many more tales to come. Please consider subscribing so we can travel through time together again. Until next time, rest well, sleep deep, and dream gently of the quiet age of steel.